He said nothing, no final words, no tears. He lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling of the death chamber as the lethal injection coursed through him. At the same moment, in the neighboring state, a man raised 2 fingers in a peace sign, then stepped into a nitrogen chamber. No appeal, no pleas. He died, as if proving he still controlled everything, even his own death. June 20, 2025. 6 death sentences in total, 6 predetermined endings, and no one escapes. In this video, we won't recount the crimes, but we will tell how they walked into death, each glance, each final word spoken, each last meal chosen, not out of hunger, but because it was one of the few things they could still control. If it were you, what would you choose? Steak, pudding, or just a glass of water? And if you knew you had only 60 minutes left, would you have anything left to say? Before we begin, drop a comment. Which country or state are you watching from? Let's see how far these stories reach. First, Thomas Lee Gudinas. On June 24, 2025, after 3 decades on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas, 51, was executed by lethal injection at a Florida prison. The death was silent at 6:13 in the evening. No friends, no clergy. Only his mother visited early that morning, offering one final goodbye to the son she couldn't save. 31 years earlier, a 20-year-old Gudinas lived with 3 friends, wandering Orlando's bars at night. On the night of May 23, 1994, they followed their usual routine: beer and drugs at home, then heading to Barbarella's, a popular nightclub at the time. They drank, slipped outside occasionally to keep the buzz going, then returned to the dance floor. At 3 in the morning, the club closed. Gudinas disappeared. That same night, Michelle Smith and her fiancé were also at Barbarella's. Around 2 in the morning, she walked to her car alone. In the parking lot, she saw a man crouched behind a vehicle, silent but menacing. She hurried, locked her car, but he followed. He yanked at the door, smashed a window, shouting horrifying threats. Smith hit her car horn. Its sound shattered the night. The man, Gudinas, fled, but he did not give up. About an hour later, 22-year-old Michelle McGrath, a recent college graduate, left alone earlier than her fiancé. She was never seen again. The next morning, a resident named Colbert Presley called police after finding clothing and keys beside a red Geo Metro. Minutes later, at the back of Pace School, staff member Jane Brand saw a young man sitting oddly on the steps. He didn't respond. He silently stood, hands fidgeting as if hiding something in his clothes. He climbed over a wall and slipped into an alley. Brand followed. And in that small alley she found Michelle McGrath, naked and lifeless. She had suffered severe trauma. Forensics suggested she may have been assaulted after death. Police arrested Gudinas shortly after. Michelle Smith identified him from photos. Jane Brand also confirmed he was the man she saw by the school. When officers searched him, they found suspicious evidence. His roommate later said, "He returned the next morning with a strange look and blood-stained clothes. When asked what happened, he replied with a cold smile and chilling confession. 'I killed her, then. Did that thing.'" At trial, lawyers described Gudinas' childhood as a storm. Abused by his father, forced to press his hand into flames, made to stand alone at night in cold with a sign reading, "I will not wet the bed." He was diagnosed with mental disorders, low IQ, and addicted to alcohol and drugs from a young age. But none of that swayed the jury. With DNA evidence, witness statements, and his confession, they sentenced him to death after a brief trial. On June 16, 1995, the sentence was pronounced death for murder, plus decades for related charges. Over the years, his legal team continued appeals, arguing he was no longer competent to understand why he faced execution, that he did not understand his punishment, a key constitutional point. But courts rejected those arguments, and the execution date was set. On his final day, he woke at 4:45 in the morning. Only his mother visited. No one else. No prayers, no chaplain. He requested pepperoni pizza, French fries, and soda as his last meal. At 6 in the evening, Gudinas lay on the execution gurney. Wearing a white shirt and dark pants, his gaze swept the witness chamber behind glass. He whispered something, too quiet to hear, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a final thought cast into the void. The drugs coursed through his veins. He closed his eyes. 4 minutes later, no response. At 6:13 in the evening, death was confirmed. Michelle McGrath, the 22-year-old, could never return. Her family waited 31 years to see their daughter's killer pay the price. No redemption, no relief, just a delayed ending, silent and heavy, that closed a crime that once shocked Florida. Second, Richard Gerald Jordan. For nearly half a century, he lived in a cold, concrete cell where every sound of a turning lock might have signaled the end. Richard Gerald Jordan, the oldest man on death row and the longest serving in Mississippi's history, finally reached the edge between life and death on June 25, 2025. But the road that brought him there wasn't just a string of trials, it was the long shadow of a tragedy, a turning point that could never be undone. On the morning of January 12, 1976, 34-year-old Edwina Martyr kissed her children goodbye and left home. She had no idea a stranger had chosen her family as a target. Jordan, a Vietnam War veteran who served 3 tours, had returned home bearing invisible scars that never healed. Jobless, broke, and out of options, he decided to kidnap a wealthy woman for ransom. Jordan traveled to Gulfport, Mississippi. He called Gulf National Bank, asking for the name of the commercial loan officer, and was given Charles "Chuck" Martyr. Using that, he looked up the address, drove there, and posed as a utility worker to get inside. Edwina answered the door, never knowing this small act of kindness would be her last. Jordan pulled a gun and forced Edwina to leave with him, leaving her 3-year-old child asleep inside. They drove deep into the DeSoto National Forest, far from witnesses. When Edwina panicked and tried to flee, Jordan stopped her. Under the stillness of the pine trees, he ordered her to kneel. No argument, no hope, just a single gunshot. She died instantly. He then tossed the gun into the Big Boxy River and moved on to part 2 of his plan: deception. He called Chuck Martyr, claiming Edwina was still alive and demanding $25,000 in ransom. Chuck worked with the FBI to set up a trap, but Jordan was cautious. He spotted the surveillance and canceled the first meeting point. The next morning, he called again with a new location near Interstate 10. This time, he left a green jacket as a signal. Chuck followed instructions and dropped the money. Jordan showed up, took the cash, and was immediately pursued. He escaped, but only for a few hours. He was arrested in a taxi near a checkpoint. No resistance, no struggle, just a quiet surrender. In the hours that followed, he confessed to everything: where he hid the body, where he dumped the gun, where he stashed the money, and even the clothes he changed into. Nothing was held back. But once the justice system kicked in, the story turned into something else: a seemingly endless loop of convictions, appeals, reversals, and retrials. Jordan was sentenced to death 4 times. Each time, a new legal issue delayed the outcome. One of those delays was tied to unclear testimony about his wartime trauma, his mental health, or the incomplete laws in Mississippi at the time of the crime. He once accepted a deal for life without parole, but later appealed, arguing the agreement itself was unlawful. That decision sent him back to death row for a 4th time in 1998. Death came slowly, but it came. In the days before the execution, Jordan was moved from his regular death row cell to a private room near the injection chamber. For 48 hours, he was allowed visits with his lawyers, family, and spiritual advisors. A prison official, and he was calm, talked a lot about the past, about the war, and about his final days. At 4 in the afternoon on June 25th, the last visitors left. Jordan then requested his final meal: fried chicken, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. At 6 in the evening, Jordan lay on the gurney, dressed in a plain white shirt and dark trousers. The execution room was silent. His wife, Marcia, sat behind the glass beside his lawyer and spiritual advisor. When asked for final words, Jordan spoke clearly. "First, I want to thank everyone for how this is still done humanely. I'm sorry to the victim's family." He thanked his attorneys, thanked his wife. Then, with one final look, said, "I love you all very much. I'll see you on the other side." At 6:16 in the evening, his heart stopped. No tears, just an ending. Richard Gerald Jordan, who had passed through 4 death sentences and spent nearly 50 years behind bars, was now just a name on a death certificate. But somewhere else, in the family of a woman who was a wife and a mother, the pain may never fully fade. Third, Anthony Floyd Wainwright. On June 10, 2025, at exactly 6:22 in the evening, the death chamber at Florida State Prison once again echoed with the cold rhythm of the nurse's signal. 1 injection, 3 drugs, and a man, once called the escaped demon, was officially declared dead. His name was Anthony Floyd Wainwright, but before he became just another name on Florida's June execution list, he was a 23-year-old from North Carolina. A man with a long criminal history, a prison escapee determined to live outside the law. The story began in the late April of 1994, when Wainwright and fellow inmate Richard Hamilton escaped from a prison in North Carolina. On the run, they weren't just fugitives seeking freedom. They wanted a car, cash, and control, anything to keep going on their own terms. Then came a fateful afternoon in a Winn-Dixie parking lot in Lake City, Florida. Carmen Gayhart, a 23-year-old mother of 2, became their target. No one knows exactly what happened in that moment. Maybe she didn't have time to scream. Maybe she believed that if she cooperated, she'd survive. But the truth is, she never came home. Carmen was kidnapped and driven over 50 miles to a remote part of Baker County. There, her body was violated, and she was killed by a single gunshot, fired from the same weapon used to take everything from her. The next day, police captured Wainwright and Hamilton in Mississippi. In their car, they found Carmen's wallet, personal items, and bloodstains that hadn't yet been cleaned. The chase ended quickly, but the nightmare was just beginning for her family. In court, Wainwright didn't make excuses or shift blame. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, witness statements, physical traces, it all painted a picture that couldn't be denied. There was no complex motive, no mystery to solve, just 2 men on the run who saw a young woman and acted as if life was a video game. The trial ended in June 1995 with a death sentence. Hamilton was also sentenced to death, but he was never executed. In 2023, he died quietly in prison of illness, his end unnoticed. Wainwright's path was different. He lived on, filing appeals for nearly 30 years. He cited exposure to Agent Orange, mental instability, family trauma, and a long list of legal arguments, but all were denied. When the governor of Florida signed his execution warrant in May 2025, his time had run out. The final day came. He was brought into the execution room around 6:10 in the evening. By law, he was allowed to choose a last meal, anything under $40, but Wainwright declined. No hamburger, no ice cream, no soda. He left no taste behind for the world to remember. Standing before the witnesses, including members of Carmen's family, he whispered something, but the room was too quiet. Whatever he said, whether a final apology, a curse, or just a breath, was lost. It ended with a simple nod and silence. Carmen's family was there. 30 years had passed since their daughter was taken from them. They had waited for this moment, but it brought no peace. No ending could soothe a heart that has lost a child. No justice could restore a life so brutally cut short. Carmen Gayhart wasn't a character in a crime story. She was real, a mother of 2, a nursing student with dreams of working in a hospital. She had gone grocery shopping on a normal April afternoon, and with just a few wrong steps, she became a statistic in a forensics report. Wainwright died in the silence he chose. No loved ones came to say goodbye, no final words etched in memory. No one cried. But his death, 3 decades too late, was a chilling reminder. Justice may not come on time, but when it does, it shows no mercy. In that June, he was the first to be called. Not because his crime was the worst, or his case the most complex, but because the wheel of justice finally stopped on his name. And when all was done, only 3 things remained: a name, a time of death, and a family forever missing something they can never get back. Fourth, Gregory Hunt. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1988, emergency responders entered an apartment in Cordova, Alabama, and froze in place. Karen Lane, 29 years old, lay motionless on the kitchen floor, covered in injuries. The scene was deeply unsettling. One seasoned paramedic turned away at the sight, not because he was shocked, but because what he saw looked like pure rage, not a typical act of violence. From the very beginning, investigators knew who they were looking for: Gregory Hunt, the victim's recent boyfriend and cousin to her roommate, Tina Cook. Greg had seemed quiet at first, but just weeks into dating Karen, he became controlling, angry, and threatening. Karen had told friends she wanted out, but Greg didn't want to be left. He couldn't handle losing control. On the night of August 1st, just hours before the incident, Greg showed up at the apartment. Witnesses said he stared blankly and muttered, "She's driving me crazy. I could kill her." That evening, Karen and Tina went to visit Tina's boyfriend. But when they arrived, Greg's car was already parked out front. Karen didn't go inside. She turned around and drove off. Greg lost control, calling friends, calling Karen's mother, making threats, shouting over the phone, "If you don't tell me where she is, something bad is going to happen." Around midnight, Greg set fire to Karen's former home. When asked why, he said, "I took away the last thing she had." Around 2 in the morning, a neighbor heard glass shatter. Looking outside, they saw They saw Greg climbing through a broken window. Not long after, Tina received a phone call. His voice was ice cold. "Karen is lying on the kitchen floor. Somebody should take her to the hospital." When officers arrived, the apartment felt like a place of mourning. Karen was gone. Her body spoke for itself. No explanation needed. Gregory Hunt wasn't there. Right after that chilling phone call, saying Karen was on the kitchen floor, he vanished. By the time police reached the scene, he had already fled, driving over 50 miles to the small town of Coleman. There, Greg called relatives in Florida. His voice was shaky and confused. He claimed he and Karen had been out together, got into an argument, and that he didn't remember exactly how he left. A few days later, once in custody, he faced his sister in jail. She asked him directly, "Did you do it?" Greg didn't hesitate. He didn't deflect. Yes, he said he had been drinking, had taken drugs, and had lost control. He claimed he didn't mean to. But Karen's body told a different story. Forensic teams found traces of DNA, fingerprints, shoe prints, and blood scattered throughout the apartment. Clear signs that Greg had been at the scene. At trial, witnesses came forward one by one. Karen's friends recalled the threats she had received. Her family confirmed they had heard him scream through the phone, "I don't care if I go back to prison. If I have to, I will." When those words were read aloud in court, the entire room fell silent. Not out of shock, but because everyone knew. He had said it. He had warned them. And then, he did exactly what he said he would. On June 19, 1990, Gregory Hunt was sentenced to death. The court recorded 3 counts of capital murder: committing murder during a burglary, committing murder with exceptional cruelty, committing murder against a defenseless victim. The jury voted 11-1. That was all it took. Karen was not there to hear the verdict, but what had been done to her body spoke on her behalf. And Greg, upon hearing the sentence, just sat still. No protest, no tears, no bowed head. As if, in that moment, he knew there was nothing left to say. Gregory Hunt entered death row in 1990, and would remain there for nearly 3 decades. In the early years, he said almost nothing. Appeals were filed and denied. Lawyers came and went. But one thing never changed. Greg never denied killing Karen Lane. According to his own words, everything began to shift after year 10. During a stretch of disciplinary isolation, left with nothing but a flickering ceiling light and the sound of metal doors, Greg began reading the Bible. Not out of remorse, not for redemption. "I did it to keep my head from exploding," he wrote. From that point on, he kept a soft-cover Bible, the spine falling apart, pages marked in pencil. He wrote gospel lyrics on scraps of toilet paper, passed them to fellow inmates, and then went quiet for years. A corrections officer said, "He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't like the others. Hunt didn't talk about the case. He just talked about God." Greg's final appeals lawyer shared this. The jury that sentenced him to death never heard about his childhood. growing up surrounded by violence, bouncing between orphanages, addicted to drugs by age 14. We're not saying Greg was innocent. We're saying the jury never got the full story. The court rejected the appeal. Greg didn't fight back. When asked about the death sentence, he said, "I used to live without God. I should have been dead a long time ago. This prison, it's not hell, it's a hospital." And sometimes he added, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I just hope I'm clear enough to die the right way." Years before Alabama finalized any guidelines, Gregory Hunt chose nitrogen gas. Under state law, death row inmates could choose between 3 methods: lethal injection, the electric chair, or nitrogen hypoxia, a process that replaces oxygen with pure nitrogen, leading to death by oxygen deprivation. But when Greg made his choice, the procedure hadn't been fully developed, and no one really knew what would happen. When asked why he would choose a method that had never been proven, Greg simply said, "I don't want to die in a way that makes me shake. I want it to be quiet." He was the 5th person in Alabama to request nitrogen gas, and the first to go through with it, after the execution of Kenneth Smith in early 2024, a case that shocked the world when Smith was heard moaning for 22 minutes inside the chamber. Human rights groups have described nitrogen hypoxia as a form of forced suffocation with unknown physical consequences. Greg knew all of that, but he never changed his mind. He didn't ask, "Will it hurt?" Maybe because he knew no one could promise it wouldn't. In a short call before the execution, Greg said only this, "There's no pity party here, I'm just fighting," until they shut off the light inside me. June 10th, 2025. After nearly 30 years behind bars, all appeals had been exhausted. Every option had run its course. Gregory Hunt was informed that his execution would take place that evening. He declined a final meal. He didn't ask for anything special. He ate a simple lunch tray, bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit juice, then remained silent for the rest of the day. At 5:52 p.m., the curtains in the execution chamber were drawn open. Gregory Hunt lay on the gurney, wrapped in a white sheet, arms strapped tightly at his sides. A death mask covered his face, sealed over both nose and mouth. No IV lines, no electric helmet, just a mask. When the sentence was formally read, Greg offered no final words. He raised 2 fingers in a peace sign. Small, quick. Then he went still. At 5:55 p.m., the nitrogen began to flow. No one in the room knew exactly what to expect. No doctor had confirmed the process would be gentle. Witnesses held their breath, watching for any sign of what would happen next. By 5:57 p.m., Greg's body began to react. He lifted his head off the gurney, eyes wide open, breathing rapidly. There was a faint sound, almost like a moan. 2 minutes later, at 5:59 p.m., he raised his leg, tensed his arms, then went slack again. For more than a minute after that, Greg gasped in long, broken intervals, as if his body was still trying to find oxygen, even though the chamber was filled with nothing but nitrogen. By 6:05, Greg stopped moving, his eyes closed. His body went still, but his left hand remained clenched, tight, unmoving, long after the heart monitor had been placed. At 6:26 p.m., he was pronounced dead. No one in the room cried, no one offered forgiveness, no one shouted. There was only a strange silence, as if everyone was waiting, listening, to find out whether this death had truly been peaceful as promised. As Gregory Hunt was gone. No screaming, no pleading, just one final breath, drained to the last, and a clenched hand that seemed unwilling to let go. 30 years earlier, he had taken a woman's life, and for 3 decades after, he tried to live as someone else, writing gospel lyrics, holding tight to a tattered Bible, and choosing a death no one could promise would be gentle. Was that enough to redeem him? He once said, "I don't need pity, I'm just fighting until they shut off the light inside me." That light is now gone, but the question still lingers. If you could look into a man's eyes in his final moment, what would you see? Regret? Peace? Or maybe, just maybe, a reflection of something human in yourself. 5th, John Hanson. On June 12, 2025, in Oklahoma, the execution chamber doors opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. Just 11 minutes later, it was over. John Hanson, 61 years old, lay still on the lethal injection table. No struggle, no plea. His final words were brief and surprisingly soft. Peace to everyone. A farewell that sounded more like a preacher than a man condemned for taking 2 lives. August 31st, 1999, Tulsa County, Oklahoma. Mary Bowles, 77, a retired bank employee and president of the St. Francis Hospital Auxiliary, left the shopping center like she did every day. She was the kind of woman everyone admired. Gentle, well-mannered, always carrying an old brown handbag and a warm smile. As she opened her car trunk, 2 men approached, George John Hanson and Victor Miller. They didn't want her cash. They didn't steal her purse. They wanted the car, and they needed her inside to avoid suspicion. She was pushed into the back seat. The car pulled away, carrying an elderly woman unaware this would be her final ride. Hanson sat in the back, pressing a gun to Mary's back. Miller drove. They headed toward a remote property in Owasso, a spot they had used before for criminal activity. But what they didn't expect was that the land wasn't empty. Gerald Max Thurman, the property owner, was nearby making deliveries. As the 44-year-old trucking company owner, he was always alert to anything unusual on his land. Thurman called his nephew to report the strange vehicle circling the property. He didn't know he was facing 2 men willing to kill to avoid being caught. Victor Miller stepped out of the car, revolver in hand. Without warning, he fired 4 shots at the man standing near his truck. Gerald Max Thurman collapsed, unconscious but still alive. Meanwhile, Hanson pulled Mary Bowles from the car. He led her deeper into the wooded land, forced her to kneel, and ended her life with a single shot. No one knows what she said, if anything at all. The 2 men tossed a few branches over her body and fled. Thurman was found soon after by a nearby resident who heard the gunfire. He was rushed to the hospital and fought for his life for 14 days. On September 14, 1999, Gerald Max Thurman, a father, husband, and business owner, passed away. 1 week after the killings, on September 8th, Hanson and Miller robbed a bank in Tulsa. On September 9th, they were captured at a motel. When officers searched their car, they found DNA and fingerprints on Mary's vehicle. 2 firearms, a .38 caliber and a 9mm pistol, had been wrapped in plastic and hidden in the gas tank. These were the murder weapons. Hanson was charged with the murder of Mary Bowles and sentenced to death. He was also given life without parole for the death of Gerald Thurman. Miller, who pulled the trigger on Thurman, was also sentenced to death. But after years of appeals, his sentence was reduced to life in prison for both murders. For more than 20 years, John Hanson wasn't in an Oklahoma prison. Due to federal charges from the bank robbery, he was housed at USP Pollock in Louisiana. In 2022, Oklahoma scheduled his execution, but under the federal government at that time, the transfer was denied. It wasn't until early 2025, when federal execution policies were reinstated, that Hanson was returned to Oklahoma custody. On May 7, 2025, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 to deny clemency. Hanson wrote no final letters, offered no apology, left no public statement, just one line: peace to everyone. He did not request a final meal, no steak, no dessert. His last meal was the standard prison tray: lunch meat, beans, carrots, and fruit juice, no different than any other inmate's lunch. At 10 o'clock in this morning on June 12th, staff strapped his arms and legs to the table. At 10:11, his heartbeat stopped. The victims' families were present. Thurman's son, now in his 40s, didn't cry. He said one sentence to the press: "At last, we can close a nightmare that lasted nearly 3 decades." Mary Bowles was buried in a small cemetery in Tulsa. Her headstone reads, "A woman who lived to serve." Gerald Thurman is remembered as an unsung hero, killed for simply doing what was right. As for John Hanson, the third man executed in June 2025, he left the world in silence, just as he chose. And one final sentence, whose meaning no one fully understands: peace to everyone. Sixth, Stephen Stanko. Stephen Stanko wasn't always a fugitive. At one point, he was seen as a symbol of second chances. Back in 1996, he was convicted in South Carolina for kidnapping and assault. He served 8.5 years out of a 10-year sentence. While inside, he co-authored a book titled Living in Prison, a history of the correctional system with an insider's view. In 2004, after being released, he moved to Myrtle Beach. He rented a room, was honest about his past, and tried to find steady work, though nothing lasted. Locals described him as intelligent-looking and reserved. He often said his criminal record made it nearly impossible to rebuild. About a year later, he told people he was moving to help care for a friend's elderly mother, but that wasn't true. Instead, he began spending hours at the public library, telling others he was researching a second book. There, he met Laura Ling, a 43-year-old librarian. What started as casual conversation soon became personal. Eventually, Laura invited him into her home, which she shared with her teenage daughter. Around that same time, Stephen Stanko began spending more time with a familiar face at the library: Henry Lee Turner, a 74-year-old retiree. They talked often, shared books, small talk between strangers who had become something like friends. But behind Stanko's calm demeanor was something darker. He wasn't just reading. He was collecting stories, obsessively consuming articles about Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, and other infamous serial killers. He claimed it was research, but to law enforcement, it looked like something else: preparation. April 8, 2005. Inside a modest home in Morels Inlet, South Carolina, the home Laura Ling shared with her teenage daughter, a scream shattered the quiet. What happened next unfolded in minutes. Laura Ling, the woman who believed she was helping a man rebuild his life, was tragically killed. Her daughter was attacked and left in critical condition. But she didn't die. Bleeding and terrified, she reached a phone, dialed 911, and whispered, "My mom is dead. I've been hurt." When first responders arrived, it was too late for Laura, but her daughter was still alive, and her testimony would change everything. By then, Stephen Stanko was gone, but he didn't disappear into the night. He kept moving, and by that same evening, he was knocking on Henry Turner's door. He told Henry his father had just passed. He needed a place to stay. The elderly man didn't ask questions, just let him in. The next morning, over eggs and toast, they had breakfast like nothing had happened. And when Henry went to the bathroom to shave, back turned, unaware, Stanko walked in, raised a gun, pressed a pillow against it, and pulled the trigger. Henry dropped, wounded, but still breathing, so Stanko struck him again, then fired again, causing fatal injuries. Then he cleaned out Henry's wallet, took his truck, and vanished. Over the next 48 hours, Stanko drove south, blending in with the crowds pouring into Augusta, Georgia, for the Masters golf tournament. He claimed to be a businessman, told people he owned a chain of Hooters restaurants. No one questioned him. He looked the part, spoke well, dressed sharp, but his photo was already everywhere. Wanted posters, news alerts, a $10,000 reward. On April 12th, a woman he had been staying with opened the newspaper and saw his face. She didn't hesitate. She called the police. Federal agents arrived within hours. Stanko was arrested without resistance. Inside the apartment, they found the murder weapon, a stolen laptop, and piles of evidence. Stephen Stanko, once called articulate and refined, now sat in cuffs, silent. August 18th, 2006. Nearly 16 months after the killings, Stanko stood trial in Georgetown County, South Carolina. He was charged with the murder of Laura Ling and the attempted murder of her daughter. The courtroom was tense. Prosecutors played the 911 call. The girl's voice, shaking, afraid, but alive, echoed through the room. The defense didn't deny the crime. Instead, they pleaded insanity, hoping to spare Stanko from the death penalty. But the jury didn't buy it. They ruled that the killings were deliberate, calculated, and carried out after Stanko left Laura's home. The sentence, death, for the murder of Laura Ling, plus 110 years in prison for the assault, the attempted murder, and armed robbery. 3 years later, in November of 2009, Stanko faced trial again, this time in Horry County for the murder of Henry Turner. The court found he had shot the elderly man during his escape, with the clear intent to steal his money and vehicle. And once again, the verdict was death. For the second time, Stephen Stanko was sentenced to death. At both trials, he never spoke in his own defense. He didn't plead for mercy. He sat in silence, as if the outcome no longer mattered. After the verdicts, Stanko was transferred to Broad River Correctional Institution, where South Carolina houses its death row inmates. In the early years, he remained out of the public eye. No interviews, no statements, no requests for clemency. But the legal process continued behind the scenes. Under South Carolina law, death sentences trigger automatic appeals, and Stanko's case followed the same path. On September 23, 2007, he appeared before the South Carolina Supreme Court, seeking to overturn his conviction for the murder of Laura Ling. His legal team argued that the trial judge had failed to allow proper jury questioning about mental illness, and that Stanko's age and psychological history should have been considered as mitigating factors. The court disagreed. The conviction and the death sentence were upheld. In 2013, he filed a second appeal, this time for the murder of Henry Turner. That, too, was denied. The court ruled that the trial had been fair and the sentence appropriate. By 2015, he filed a final petition for post-conviction relief, claiming that a brain abnormality might have influenced his actions. But after several hearings, the court again found no grounds for change. On May 24, 2016, the sentence was reaffirmed. Then came May of 2024. Nearly 8 years later, Stanko made his last legal move, a petition to the United States Supreme Court. It was denied on May 5, 2025. After nearly 2 decades of litigation, every appeal had failed. On May 16th, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued an execution order, setting the date for June 13th, the earliest legally available time following a state holiday. Under state law, inmates are given a choice of execution method: electric chair, lethal injection, or firing squad. If no choice is made, the default is the electric chair. Initially, Stanko considered the firing squad. He said it seemed quick, clean, but after reviewing a report from an earlier execution, one in which a man's body was severely damaged and the process dragged on far longer than expected, he changed his mind. He asked the court for more information about the procedures. They denied the request. By the deadline, Stephen Stanko chose lethal injection. On the afternoon of June 13th, he was served his final meal: fried fish, fried shrimp, crab cake, baked potato, carrots, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. At 6:29 in the evening, he was strapped to the gurney inside the chamber at Broad River. An IV line was inserted. The first dose of pentobarbital began to flow. When asked for final words, Stanko delivered a statement lasting over 3 minutes. He apologized to the families. "I am truly sorry for the pain and loss that I caused in this horrible situation. Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said." He appeared to whisper something under his breath. His lips moved. His eyes drifted toward the viewing room, where the families of the victims sat, watching in silence. At 6:34, he was pronounced dead. No one in the room cried. No one spoke. Only one voice broke the silence: the son of Henry Turner, who had waited nearly 20 years for justice. He told the press, "This should have ended years ago. My father was a good man. He didn't deserve to die for trusting the wrong person." Stephen Stanko, once seen as an educated man, a model of rehabilitation, died with every illusion stripped away. No glory, no escape, just silence. And the kind of memory that time alone cannot erase. 6 names, 6 endings, no two the same. But every tragedy began with a fracture, in a soul, in a system, and ended in blood, sorrow, and irreversible loss. No justice can bring back a mother, a father, or a wife. But, at the very least, the truth was acknowledged. If there's one thing to remember, remember them. Not because their deaths were the ending, but because their deaths are a call to pay attention to life. If you believe this journey matters, leave a comment. Like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. There are more stories that need to be told.